about everyone in Nebraska that has either a lawn or a garden area sooner or later has to make decisions about possible pesticide applications or whether to make the applications at all. You may not be aware of some potential consequences that can happen when you do make these pesticide applications if they're done improperly or in the wrong areas. Probably the best way that you can use to help prevent those kinds of misapplications or unintended consequences is through IPM. Really, you just consider the sites that you're considering to make the applications in, and if you have things such as sandy areas or places that are close to streams or rivers or ponds, possibly a well on your site or your land area, you may have to make adjustments in how you do those applications. Another approach that you can use to help prevent unintended consequences is through the selection of the pesticides that you use. You want to use pesticides that are least likely to move off the site and find their way into water supply areas. The most common way that this is going to happen is through storm drains in streets in cities and towns across the state. And so if you choose pesticides that are less likely to drift or leach or move off that site, you're going to prevent those kinds of problems from occurring. Another thing that can be done to help prevent unintended consequences is through the use of a simple device such as this right here. It just attaches to your garden hose, and if you're filling a larger spray application equipment, it prevents any backflow or siphoning that might happen, and which would actually contaminate the water supply in your community. Timing is another important aspect to consider when making pesticide applications. You of course aren't going to want to apply a herbicide during a strong wind. Also, you need to think about, is it too early in the spring? Or is it late in the fall when the soil may have been frozen already or too cold to make those applications where they might make sense? It also doesn't make sense to apply a pesticide that might be vulnerable to leaching on sandy soils that you may know that you have already. So if you do have considered all these things, if you've looked at integrated pest management, you're using good common sense, you've decided that you do need to make a pesticide application, you should kind of keep some few things in mind. One is the storage of the pesticide. If you store it in a shed or something that's close to a stream that you might have a flood, that could actually contaminate the water quite easily. So you want to have these storage areas well above whatever the high water mark in your area is. The other thing to think about in storage is if you have a small spill, whether it's granules or liquid, you need to clean that up immediately. Of course, the obvious thing to think about when you're making a pesticide application is that you want to stay away from these vulnerable areas. You might not think about it, but your backyard pond that has fish in it, if you're making a granular application of an insecticide, for instance, you may end up killing those fish in that pond. Another thing to think about is granules are the most common application in turf areas. Often you try to get right to the edge of the turf, and as you're doing that, you're inevitably going to get granules on that sidewalk area. So you need to be sure to sweep those up thoroughly after you've completed that application so that those granules are less likely to move off the site. And then the final point to consider is when you have completed your application and you go to clean up that application equipment, the water, the rinsate that you might have in a spray tank or in a granular applicating device, you want to be careful not to let that liquid run down the storm sewers. If you do, what you're doing is you're just transferring that pesticide out of those application equipment directly into the water supply in the area. So that's something that's critical to avoid. As you think about some of the things that I've mentioned today, I'd like you to keep in mind 3 key points. First, use integrated pest management and good cultural practices to help reduce the amount of pesticides that you use and possibly eliminate them altogether. When using pesticides, keep in mind some of the practices that I mentioned to help prevent unintended consequences and potential contamination of water supplies through all aspects of the applying, the mixing and loading, the cleanup, storage, all those aspects that I've mentioned. And finally, always read and follow very carefully label instructions. These instructions will help you prevent any unintended consequences as well as always protecting the water supplies in Nebraska.